In the heart of a bustling city, where skyscrapers kissed the sky and honking cars filled the streets, life moved at a chaotic pace. Amidst all this hustle and bustle, there was a man who seemed almost invisible to everyone around him. He sat on the sidewalk at the corner of 5th and Main, his face weathered by years of hardship. His clothes were worn out, patched together with threads that barely held them intact. To most people passing by, he was just another homeless person, a faceless figure they'd glance at briefly before moving on with their busy lives. But if you looked closer, really paid attention, you'd notice something different about him. There was a certain stillness in the way he carried himself, like someone who had seen too much but learned how to keep it locked inside. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet strength, as if he'd once been part of something bigger than the world now saw him as. And yet, no one stopped to ask his story or wonder what brought him here. No one except for one man sitting quietly nearby at a small cafe across the street. An older gentleman sipped his coffee while pretending to read a newspaper. He wasn't flashy or loud. Instead, he blended into the background effortlessly. But beneath his calm exterior lay years of experience earned not in boardrooms or classrooms, but on battlefields far away from home. This man had spent decades leading some of the toughest missions imaginable, commanding elite forces known only to a select few. Now retired, he preferred to stay low-key, observing the world rather than actively participating in it. As he watched the homeless man from behind his newspaper, something tugged at the back of his mind. It wasn't pity or curiosity, it was recognition. The posture, the subtle alertness, even the way the man occasionally scanned the crowd reminded him of soldiers he'd led during his time in service. Whoever this person was, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. Something about him stood out, though the observer couldn't quite put his finger on why. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement when two police officers approached the homeless man. At first, it seemed like a routine check. They asked questions, probably wanting to know why he was sitting there or whether he had identification. Most days, such interactions ended without incident, but today felt different. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity before a storm. One officer raised his voice, demanding answers more forcefully than necessary. The other shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if unsure how to handle the situation. Meanwhile, the homeless man tried to respond calmly, reaching slowly into his coat pocket to pull out his ID, but in that split second, things went horribly wrong. One officer shouted, "Don't move," while the other drew his weapon. Before anyone could react, shots rang out, echoing through the street like thunderclaps. Time seemed to freeze. People froze mid-step, mouths open in shock. Some screamed, others ran for cover, unsure of what was happening. When the chaos finally settled, the homeless man lay crumpled on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The officers stood frozen too, their guns still pointed forward, faces pale with panic. Bystanders began murmuring among themselves, pointing fingers and pulling out phones to record the aftermath. All of this unfolded right in front of the man at the cafe. Every detail, the body language of the officers, the terrified expressions of witnesses, the chilling sound of gunfire was etched into his memory. Anger bubbled inside him, hot and raw. He knew exactly what had happened. Fear had overridden reason, and someone's life had been taken because of it. For a moment, he considered stepping in. After all, he'd faced danger countless times before, always ready to act when needed. But something held him back. Maybe it was instinct telling him to wait, to gather information first before making any moves. Whatever the reason, he stayed, rooted to his spot, watching silently as paramedics rushed to the scene and reporters began swarming like bees to honey. What none of them realized, not the officers, not the bystanders, certainly not the media, was that this moment would change everything. Because the man sitting at the cafe wasn't just another witness. He was someone who understood power, discipline, and justice better than most. And deep down, he knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Not on his watch. The sound of gunfire still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, as chaos erupted on the street. People screamed, some ran for cover, while others stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The homeless man lay motionless on the ground, his body crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. Blood seeped out slowly, staining the pavement beneath him, a stark reminder of how quickly life can slip away. The two officers who had fired their weapons stared at the scene, with wide eyes, their faces pale and trembling. One of them dropped to his knees, muttering something under his breath, while the other frantically called for backup over his radio. Their voices cracked with panic, each word laced with disbelief. They hadn't meant for this to happen, at least, that's what they would later claim. But intentions don't bring people back from the dead. Bystanders began filming the scene on their phones, capturing every detail. The blood-soaked ground, the officers pacing nervously, the growing crowd of shocked onlookers. Some shouted angrily at the cops, demanding answers, while others sobbed quietly, overwhelmed by the brutality of it all. It was clear that no one knew quite what to do. The situation felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but this was real life, unfolding right before their eyes. Through all the commotion, the man sitting at the cafe remained eerily calm. His hands rested lightly on the table in front of him, fingers drumming softly against the surface. He watched everything unfold with sharp focus, taking note of every movement, every reaction. Years of training had taught him to stay composed, even in moments of crisis, but inside he was anything but calm. Anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He replayed the events in his mind, dissecting them frame by frame. He saw the way the homeless man had reached into his coat pocket, not suddenly, not aggressively, but deliberately, as if trying to retrieve something important. An ID card, perhaps. Or maybe nothing at all. Either way, it wasn't enough to justify pulling the trigger. And yet, here they were. What bothered him most was the fear he saw in the officer's eyes. Not fear of danger, but fear of consequences. Fear of being wrong, of making a mistake, of having to answer for their actions. That kind of fear could make anyone reckless, especially when combined with power. But power comes with responsibility. And these men had failed miserably in that regard. As paramedics arrived and hurried toward the fallen man, the observer leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wanted to believe there was still hope, that somehow, against all odds, the victim might survive. But deep down he knew better. The amount of blood pooling around him told a grim story, one that couldn't be rewritten no matter how hard anyone tried. The medics worked quickly, loading the man onto a stretcher and rushing him toward an ambulance. Sirens wailed as they sped off, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and whispered conversations among witnesses. Reporters began gathering, shoving microphones into people's faces, desperate for quotes and reactions. The news cycle would soon devour this tragedy, turning it into headlines and hashtags, but none of that mattered to the man at the cafe. For him, this wasn't about sensationalism or public outrage. It was personal. He'd spent years protecting lives, both on the battlefield and off it. He understood the weight of taking someone's life, how final it was, how irreversible. To see it happen so carelessly, so needlessly, ignited a fire within him that refused to die down. Without drawing attention to himself, he rose from his seat and moved closer to the scene. He blended seamlessly into the crowd, listening intently. to snippets of conversation. Some bystanders defended the officers, saying they must have felt threatened. Others condemned them outright, accusing them of acting out of prejudice rather than necessity. Each perspective added another layer to the tangled web of emotions surrounding the incident, but the observer didn't rely solely on hearsay. Using skills honed through decades of covert operations, he discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording everything. He captured the positions of the officers, the expressions on their faces, the reactions of the crowd. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. He also noted badge numbers and patrol car IDs, committing them to memory in case they disappeared from official reports later. When he finally returned to his apartment that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet his mind raced with thoughts of what he'd witnessed. Sitting at his desk, he reviewed the footage he'd recorded, pausing occasionally to jot down notes. There were inconsistencies everywhere. The timeline didn't match up. The officers' accounts contradicted each other, and several key details seemed conveniently omitted. Determined to uncover the truth, he dug deeper. A quick search online revealed troubling patterns. Both officers had histories of complaints filed against them for excessive force, though neither had faced significant consequences. Internal investigations had been conducted, but findings were vague, often concluding with phrases like "no wrongdoing found" or "incident resolved." It was infuriating, yet unsurprising. Systems designed to protect sometimes did more harm than good. Hours passed as he pieced together the puzzle, connecting dots that others might miss. By morning, he had compiled a dossier filled with evidence, video clips, witness statements, records of past misconduct, all pointing to one undeniable conclusion: justice hadn't been served. Worse, it likely never would unless someone stepped in to tip the scales, but tipping those scales came with risks. Exposing corruption, especially within institutions as powerful as law enforcement, wasn't without consequences. Retaliation was almost guaranteed, whether through legal threats, smear campaigns, or worse. Still, the observer knew he couldn't sit idly by. This wasn't just about one man's death. It was about accountability, fairness, and ensuring that such tragedies didn't happen again. With a deep breath, he reached out to trusted contacts, former comrades, investigative journalists, activists who shared his commitment to truth. He shared the evidence anonymously, knowing full well the potential fallout. For him, this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. As he sent off the files, a strange mix of relief and dread washed over him. Relief because he'd taken action, done what he could to set things in motion. Dread because he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Battles like this rarely were. Still, as he turned off his computer and stared out the window at the city skyline, he felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this time things could change. That the voices demanding justice would grow louder than the ones defending the status quo. And that somewhere, somehow, the memory of the man who lost his life on 5th and Main would inspire others to stand up and fight for what was right. The days following the shooting felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. The city, already tense from years of simmering frustrations, seemed to crackle with energy. News of the incident spread quickly, fueled by social media and viral videos captured by bystanders. Within hours, hashtags began trending online, each post adding fuel to the growing fire of public outrage. People demanded answers, accountability, and justice, not just for the man who had lost his life, but for countless others whose stories had been buried under layers of indifference. For the observer, the weight of what he'd witnessed continued to press down on him. He couldn't shake the image of the homeless man lying motionless on the ground, or the sound of those gunshots echoing in his ears. It haunted him, not because it was shocking, He'd seen death up close before, but because it was so unnecessary. Lives weren't supposed to end this way, especially not at the hands of those sworn to protect them. Despite the emotional toll, he stayed focused. His apartment became a makeshift command center, cluttered with papers, notes, and screenshots. From hours of research, every piece of evidence he gathered told a story that painted a picture far uglier than most people realized. The officers involved weren't isolated bad apples. They were part of a pattern, one that stretched back years. Complaints about their behavior had piled up over time, yet nothing had changed. Promises of reform were made, investigations launched, and reports filed, but somehow, justice always slipped through the cracks. As word of the shooting spread, protests erupted across the city. Crowds poured into the streets, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding change. Some marched peacefully, while others voiced their anger more forcefully. Tensions ran high as demonstrators clashed with police, creating scenes that played out live on national television. For many watching at home, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of how deep-seated these issues truly were. Amidst all the chaos, whispers began circulating about someone pulling strings behind the scenes. Anonymous tips started surfacing online, pointing fingers at hidden connections within law enforcement and government agencies. No one knew exactly who was responsible, but speculation grew louder every day. Could it be an insider? Someone with access to classified information? Or perhaps someone who understood the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses? What no one suspected, least of all the authorities, was that the person orchestrating this quiet rebellion was sitting quietly in his modest apartment, miles away from the protests and headlines. To anyone who crossed paths with him, he seemed ordinary, a retired veteran living a simple life, keeping to himself, blending seamlessly into the background. But beneath that calm exterior lay decades of experience, a mind trained to think strategically, and a heart driven by a fierce sense of purpose. One evening, as dusk settled over the city, he received a message from an old contact, a journalist, known for uncovering hard truths. She wanted to meet, claiming she'd heard rumors about leaked documents exposing misconduct within the police department. Though cautious, he agreed, knowing her reputation for integrity. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, away from prying eyes. When they finally sat down together, the air between them buzzed with urgency. She listened intently as he explained everything, the footage he'd recorded, the patterns he'd uncovered, the systemic failures that allowed incidents like this to happen repeatedly. At first, she was skeptical, asking tough questions to test the validity of his claims. But as he laid out the evidence piece by piece, her skepticism turned to determination. By the end of their conversation, she was nodding firmly, ready to take action. "You're taking a big risk," she warned him, her voice low but steady. "If this gets traced back to you—" He cut her off with a small smile. "I know the risks," he said simply, "but I also know what's at stake. If we don't do something now, when will it ever stop?" Her resolve hardened. Together, they devised a plan to release the evidence strategically, ensuring maximum impact without compromising safety. They decided to share the information with multiple outlets simultaneously, making it harder for anyone to suppress the truth. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best chance they had. Over the next few days, the Observer worked tirelessly, finalizing the dossier and preparing for the fallout. Sleep eluded him, replaced by endless cups of coffee and restless pacing. He replayed scenarios in his head, anticipating every possible outcome. What if the officers retaliated? What if his identity was exposed? What if nothing changed, despite all his efforts? But even in his darkest moments, he reminded himself why he was doing this. This wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about hope. Hope that shining a light on injustice could spark real change. Hope that people would see the humanity behind the headlines and demand better. Hope that the man who had died on 5th and Main wouldn't be forgotten. Finally, the day came when the evidence went public. It hit like a tidal wave, crashing through the walls of denial and complacency that had protected the status quo for so long. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, dissecting every detail and amplifying calls for accountability. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from grief and anger to solidarity and resolve. Protesters rallied around the country, carrying signs bearing phrases like, "Enough is enough," and "Justice can't wait." Meanwhile, the officers at the center of the controversy found themselves under intense scrutiny. Their past actions were dragged into the spotlight, forcing them to answer for years of unchecked misconduct. Internal investigations were reopened, this time with renewed pressure from higher-ups who couldn't ignore the mounting public outcry. Even politicians weighed in, promising reforms and transparency, though whether their promises would lead to meaningful change remained to be seen. It all, the observer watched silently, tracking developments from the shadows. He didn't seek recognition or praise. His goal had never been personal glory. Instead, he found satisfaction in seeing the ripple effects of his actions, the conversations sparked, the questions asked, the momentum building towards something greater than himself. Yet he knew the fight was far from over. Justice wasn't a single victory. It was a continuous battle, one that required vigilance and persistence. As he stared out his window at the city skyline, lit up against the night sky, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Somewhere out there, people were standing up, speaking out, refusing to let fear silence them. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, he felt a flicker of optimism, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. With that thought lingering in his mind, he turned off the lights and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for now, he let himself rest, knowing he'd done what he could to tip the scales toward justice. The weeks that followed the release of the evidence felt like a whirlwind, with events spiraling faster than anyone could have anticipated. The city and soon the entire nation was gripped by a mix of outrage, grief, and determination. The story of the shooting on 5th and Main had become more than just another tragic headline. It was now a symbol of something much larger. It represented years of frustration, broken promises, and systemic failures that many had long suspected but struggled to prove. Now, thanks to the anonymous leak, the truth was out in the open, impossible to ignore. For the two officers involved, life changed overnight. What had once been a routine day turned into a nightmare they couldn't escape. Their faces were plastered across newspapers and TV screens, their names whispered in hushed tones everywhere they went. Some defended them, arguing that they were simply doing their jobs under pressure. Others condemned them harshly, calling for immediate consequences. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear: these officers were no longer untouchable. Figures of authority, they were human beings facing judgment for their actions. Internal investigations ramped up quickly, with higher-ups scrambling to address public demands for accountability. Lawyers pored over files, dissecting every detail of the case. Witnesses came forward, some reluctantly, others eager to share what they'd seen. Meanwhile, the homeless man who had lost his life became more than just a victim. He became a person, a story worth telling. Friends he'd made on the streets spoke about his kindness despite his struggles. A former co-worker revealed that he'd once held a steady job before circumstances beyond his control pushed him into homelessness. Slowly, the humanity of the man began to emerge, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. Amidst all this chaos, the observer from the cafe continued to operate quietly behind the scenes. He didn't seek attention or recognition, but he stayed informed, watching as the pieces fell into place. News updates streamed constantly on his phone, each report adding another layer to the unfolding drama. He saw interviews with community leaders demanding reform, emotional pleas from families who had lost loved ones in similar incidents, and fiery debates among politicians about the future of policing. But it wasn't just official channels driving the conversation. Social media played a massive role, amplifying voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. Hashtags trended daily, drawing attention to stories of injustice from other cities and towns. People shared personal experiences, photos, videos, anything that shed light on the realities faced by marginalized communities. The movement gained momentum, spreading far beyond the initial incident on 5th and Main. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. As the days passed, unexpected allies began reaching out to the observer. Some were old comrades from his military days, men and women who respected his integrity and trusted his judgment. Others were activists, whistleblowers, and journalists inspired by his courage. Together, they formed a loose coalition united by a common goal: justice. They exchanged ideas, pooled resources, and strategized ways to keep the pressure on without burning bridges unnecessarily. For the first time in years, the observer felt a sense of camaraderie, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table reviewing documents, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. On the other end was a woman he hadn't spoken to in decades, an old friend from his early days in the service. Her voice was warm yet urgent as she explained why she was calling. She'd heard whispers about his involvement in exposing the shooting and wanted to offer her support. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest," she said bluntly. "And I know you don't scare easily, but be careful. Not everyone is going to play fair." Her words lingered in his mind long after the call ended. He knew she was right. The stakes were high, and not everyone would appreciate what he was doing. But caution wasn't fear, and he refused to let intimidation stop him. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts, ensuring that every move he made was calculated and deliberate. If anything, her warning only strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, the protests showed no signs of slowing down. Crowds gathered daily outside police headquarters, chanting slogans and holding vigils for the man whose life had been cut short. Some demonstrations remained peaceful, while others grew tense as frustrations boiled over. Clashes between protesters and law enforcement became increasingly common, with tear gas filling the air and arrests mounting by the hour. Yet even amid the chaos, moments of unity emerged. Strangers hugged, sang together, and promised to stand shoulder to shoulder until real change happened. Back in the courtroom, preparations for the trial intensified. Lawyers worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and crafting arguments designed to sway the jury. The prosecution painted a damning picture of negligence and abuse of power, while the defense argued that the officers had acted in self-defense. Both sides dug in, determined to win at any cost. As opening statements approached, anticipation reached a fever pitch. Everyone from legal experts to casual observers was glued to the proceedings, waiting to see whether justice would finally prevail. Through it all, the observer kept a close eye on developments, analyzing every twist and turn. He attended court sessions whenever possible, blending into the crowd and listening intently to the arguments presented. Each piece of testimony added fuel to the fire, reinforcing his belief that accountability mattered not just for the officers involved, but for the entire system they represented. Mistakes like this shouldn't happen again. And if holding individuals accountable meant preventing future tragedies, then so be it. Yet as the trial dragged on, doubts began creeping in. Would the verdict truly reflect the truth? Could a jury of ordinary citizens see past biases and prejudices to deliver a fair ruling? Or would the same patterns repeat themselves, leaving victims' families empty-handed once again? These questions weighed heavily on the observer's mind, keeping him awake at night. He reminded himself that hope wasn't naive, it was necessary. Without it, there would be no reason to keep fighting. By the time closing arguments rolled around, emotions ran high. The courtroom was packed, with reporters scribbling furiously in notebooks and cameras rolling outside. Inside, tension crackled like electricity, as if everyone collectively held their breath, waiting for the final decision. When the judge instructed the jury to deliberate, the room erupted into murmurs, speculations flying back and forth about what might happen next. For the observer, those hours waiting for the verdict felt endless. He paced his apartment, replayed key moments from the trial in his head, and tried to distract himself with mundane tasks. But nothing could fully ease the anxiety gnawing at him. This wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about proving that change was possible, that systems could be held accountable, that lives mattered, regardless of who you were or where you came from. Finally, the moment arrived. The jury returned to the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. The foreperson stood, cleared their throat, and delivered the verdict. Guilty on counts of manslaughter. Gasps filled the room as the reality sank in. Cheers erupted outside, echoing through the streets as news spread rapidly. Justice had been served, at least in this one instance. Relief washed over the observer as he listened to the outcome. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start, a step forward. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Still, as celebrations unfolded around the city, he allowed himself only a brief moment of satisfaction. There was still work to be done, battles to fight, and lives to honor. With renewed determination, he turned his focus to the next challenge, knowing that the road ahead would be long but worth it. The guilty verdict echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves far beyond the walls of that small, tense space. For many, it felt like a rare moment of vindication, a crack in the armor of a system that often seemed impenetrable. Outside, cheers erupted as news of the decision spread. Protesters hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces, while chants of "justice" rang out into the night. Strangers high-fived and shared stories of loved ones whose cases had never seen such an outcome. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for now, that was enough. For the observer who had spent countless sleepless nights working behind the scenes, the verdict brought a mix of emotions. Relief washed over him first, followed by a deep sadness that lingered long after the initial celebration faded. He sat alone in his apartment, staring at the TV screen as reporters dissected every detail of the trial's conclusion. The officers involved were sentenced to prison terms, punishment for their actions, but no amount of jail time could bring back the man who had died on 5th and Main. That loss was permanent, irreversible. And yet, the observer couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Hope that this verdict might serve as a turning point, a signal to others that accountability was possible. But hope alone wasn't enough. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about preventing future tragedies. As the media circus moved on to the next big story, the observer knew the real work was only beginning. This victory wasn't the end. It was a foundation to build upon. He thought about all the lives lost before this case and all those who might still be at risk if nothing changed. If he stopped now, what would have been the point? The fight had to continue. In the weeks following the trial, he began reaching out to some of the people he'd connected with during his investigation. Community leaders, activists, lawyers, and even former colleagues from his military days came together to brainstorm ways to create lasting change. They met in small groups, often late at night, sharing ideas and pooling resources. Some suggested lobbying for policy reforms, while others pushed for community-based programs aimed at bridging gaps between law enforcement and the public. Everyone agreed on one thing: action was needed, not just words. Inspired by these conversations, the Observer decided to take a step further. He founded an organization dedicated to addressing the root causes of systemic injustice. Calling it Unity Shield, the initiative focused on two key areas: training law enforcement officers in de-escalation techniques and providing support for veterans struggling with homelessness and trauma. It was a deeply personal mission for him, drawing on his own experiences both as a soldier and as someone who had witnessed firsthand how easily things could spiral out of control. Getting Unity Shield off the ground wasn't easy. Funding was tight, and skepticism ran high among potential partners. Many doubted whether one person could make a difference in such a complex issue. But the Observer refused to give up. He poured his savings into the project, hosting workshops and collaborating with experts to develop effective strategies. Slowly but surely, the organization gained traction. Local police departments signed up for training sessions, eager to improve relations with the communities they served. Veterans found solace in support groups, sharing their struggles and finding strength in solidarity. As months turned into years, the impact of Unity Shield became undeniable. Communities that had once been divided began working together, fostering trust where there had been none. Officers learned new approaches to conflict resolution, reducing incidents of excessive force. Homeless shelters partnered with the organization to provide specialized care for veterans, helping them rebuild their lives. Even politicians started taking notice, citing Unity Shield as a model for reform in speeches and policy proposals. In all, the Observer remained humble. He never sought recognition or accolades, preferring to stay in the background while others took center stage. To him, the true measure of success wasn't fame or praise, it was seeing tangible improvements in people's lives. When he heard stories of families reunited because a veteran received the help they needed, or when he read reports of fewer violent encounters between police and civilians, he knew his efforts were worthwhile. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Change didn't happen overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. Resistance came from unexpected places. Some within law enforcement resented the push for reform, while others dismissed grassroots movements as ineffective. Critics accused Unity Shield of being too idealistic, claiming that systemic issues were too deeply entrenched to ever truly resolve. On tough days, the Observer wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. Yet, every time he felt discouraged, he reminded himself of why he started this journey in the first place. He remembered the man on 5th and Main, the quiet dignity in his posture, the humanity stripped away by fear and prejudice. He recalled the faces of protesters demanding justice, the voices of grieving families refusing to be silenced. These memories fueled his determination, pushing him to keep going even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. Over time, the Observer's legacy grew not as a hero or a savior, but as someone who refused to look away when others turned a blind eye. His actions inspired countless others to join the cause, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. People began standing up, speaking out, and holding institutions accountable in ways they hadn't before. Conversations shifted from blame to solutions, from anger to action. Slowly but surely, the world around him began to change. Years later, when asked about his motivations, the Observer always gave the same answer: because someone has to stand up, because silence is complicity. Those simple words carried profound weight, resonating with anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. They summed up not just his philosophy, but the spirit of everyone who joined him in the fight for a better future. And so, the story of the shooting on 5th and Main became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a catalyst for transformation. It reminded people that even in the darkest moments, there are those willing to shine a light. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And that hope, however fragile, can spark movements capable of reshaping the world. The observer eventually stepped back from the forefront of Unity Shield, passing the torch to younger generations eager to carry the mission forward. He returned to his quiet life, content knowing that he had done everything he could to tip the scales toward justice. Though his name may never appear in history books, his impact will live on through the countless lives touched by his work. On a crisp autumn morning, he stood outside the cafe where it all began, watching the city bustle around him. The streets were alive with energy, filled with people rushing to work, kids laughing on their way to school, and vendors calling out to passers-by. Life went on as it always does. But somewhere in the background, faint but steady, was the sound of change happening, one conversation, one action, one heart at a time.